Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this new edition of Up Close, Stories, Objects, and Ideas from Beyond the Galleries, the Royal Alberta Museum Virtual Talk Series. My name is Eleonora Sermoneta. I'm the Adult Learning Programmer here at RAM, and I will be your host during this talk. As we start our virtual talk, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that the land upon which we stand is Treaty 6 territory, the traditional territory of the Cree and Nakota peoples, and a homeland to the Métis. This space continues to be a gathering place for generations of Dene, Blackfoot, Tsuut'ina, Saulteaux, and Inuit peoples. We honor the cultures, languages, and histories of the indigenous peoples of this place. During these talk sessions, we will have a presentation by one of our museum experts, Dr. Jocelyn Hudon, followed by a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please type them in the chat or use the Q&A feature. And I will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A, so we are sure that we are not skipping any of your questions. And today's talk is about birds. It's going to be a very interesting one because we're going to learn a lot about different colors and of the plumage and how the diet of the birds can have an impact on those colors. So it's going to be exciting. As Dr. Jocelyn Hudon anticipated, there are plenty of beautiful pictures, and I'm really looking forward to that. But obviously, I also want to provide a quick introduction about our speaker. So Dr. Jocelyn Hudon is the Curator of Ornithology at the Royal Alberta Museum, and he has worked at this museum since 1992. Jocelyn acquired early a fascination for birds, particularly the gaudy colors, their gaudy colors. And after obtaining a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Université Laval in Québec City, he went on to the University of Connecticut to study the evolution of carotenoid usage in birds, which earned him a Ph.D. He then spent 3 years at the Western College of Veterinary Medicine in Saskatoon, in Saskatchewan, as a postdoctoral fellow, investigating the pigmentation of the iris of birds before joining the Royal Alberta Museum. Jocelyn is interested generally in the nature and evolution of color ornamentations in birds, and is using a variety of techniques to help understand the origins of new forms. So thank you very much, Jocelyn, for joining us, and I'll pass the microphone to you.
Well, thanks, Eleonora, for the wonderful introduction. I really hope you enjoyed this account of a line of inquiry that I've pursued for many years. And I'll go right into my presentation. Yeah, often we don't fully appreciate how far-reaching the effects exotic species can have on the environment. By exotics, I mean species that aren't native to a given area, that are introduced either intentionally or unintentionally, but that become established in their new haunts, sometimes even become invasive, that spread widely. Sometimes our attention is piqued by headlines like this one, highlighting the dangers of exotics, like the appearance of the murder hornets on the West Coast. I saw someone from Washington. I think this is very much in the news, the concern about these hornets taking over. Now, often in the news, we get the impression these things are almost half the size of your hand. Of course, they're a lot smaller, and they're often called killer and murder hornets and whatnot. But I mean, really, the bees are the one that should be most concerned because they can really decimate a hive and so on. But there's a concern nonetheless, and certainly there are steps afoot to try to prevent this species from spreading. Another example is a giant hogweed. Another example of something happening maybe further west than here, where the secretion of that plant actually known to cause the potential to cause third-degree burns on people's skin. This is the leg of someone that's been exposed to this. Now, it's not so much the secretion itself that's causing this. It's just it's a secretion is actually preventing the skin from being protected from the light and so on. So, and exposed to the light. Closer to home, we have examples. I mean, we're reminded often Dutch elm disease and not bringing wood from outside of the province and so on. We could go on. Purple loosestrife, a plant that's changing the ecology of aquatic systems and so on. Whirling disease, even earthworms. I mean, you think of innocuous earthworms, but the earthworms are not native, first of all, and they are changing the ecology of the soils as they spread into our forests and so on. And so there's many ramifications of these things that are really never were here, and all of a sudden they start spreading and even become invasive. Now, I was involved with a situation. A lot of the effects of these exotics often are far more subtle than the examples that I provided. Often they're unintended or even unexpected. And so this is one of the case. And this goes back to when I was still a grad student. I was at the University of Connecticut in the lab of Alan H. Brush, who was a leader in the study of pigmentation in birds and so on. And I was also and that was what I was studying as well. And at a bird conference, we were presented with an unusual situation. People at the Powder Mill Research Station, which is a bird observatory in Pennsylvania, were telling us that they're seeing more and more cedar waxwings, mostly immature birds, that had an orange tip to their tails. So normally a cedar waxwing would have a yellow tip to their tails, but these birds were turning up with orange tail bands. Most of the birds were immature, but they were also adults that would show this kind of a mixture of maybe natural coloration and also reddened coloration and so on. So he came to us and asking, could you guys figure out what's going on? We've only been seeing this for about 30 some years. I mean, we have no records of cedar waxwing with orange tails before 30 years back. And so they asked us to look at it. Now, as you can see, the cedar waxwing already is able to produce some red pigmentation. We see these waxy tips at the tip of the waxwing, which gives it its name, but it has nothing to do with wax, but it does have the appearance. You can see that from the red color that it's able to synthesize red pigment. Perhaps these birds now had the ability to do this conversion of pigment and deposit those red pigments into the tail. We didn't know at the time. What we're talking about here are a class of pigment that are called carotenoids. And carotenoids are widely distributed in a lot of the things that we eat. These are examples of vegetables and fruits and whatnot that do contain carotenoids. Carotenoids are good for our health. They help with vision. They're a source of vitamin A and so on. And many birds, and carotenoids also can only be gotten from the diet. No animals or very few animals are able to make carotenoids, and thus, therefore, they must get it in their diet. And that's true for birds as well. And birds will incorporate them in their diet, and then may deposit. And some species will deposit in their feathers as these waxwings. And so, they're different types of carotenoids. And so by looking at the identity of the pigments that were in the feathers, whether they were the same one as in the wings or whether they were different, we might be able to tell what's going on. And sure enough, we were able to show that the pigment, and that's a publication that's going back to 1989 now, we were able to show that the feathers that were reddened contain a carotenoid called rhodoxanthine. Now, rhodoxanthine is a bit unusual. It's an extremely red pigment, and it's very, very narrowly distributed, very rare in nature. It had first been described from the berries. They're not truly berries because it's a conifer. We call them Orioles, but nevertheless, they're from the fruit. They were described first from the fruit of the of the yew trees. Actually, there's several species, including the Japanese yew. And it's a very unusual, it's only found in these arrows and leaves of various plants and so on, which would really not be a source, a pigment for birds and so on. These birds in Pennsylvania that were turning up with orange bands in the east would only have had maybe the Canada hue, which is distributed in the east, but it's not very widely distributed. It tends to be an understory shrub, very low, very uncommon, and certainly there hadn't been any change in distribution of the hue in the last 30 some years as well. And so we went looking for perhaps a different source of this pigment. And at the time I had left the lab, I had graduated and so on. And so my supervisor actually was provided with a series of different berries that could potentially be a source of roloxanthine that would have been introduced relatively recently and so on. So we're looking for something that it would make sense to think it's in the last 30 years or so. And sure enough, he was able to document this pigment, which is rather uncommon, into one species of honeysuckle, the Morrow's honeysuckle. And it is an exotic. It is not a species that's native to North America, though it's now fairly widely distributed. It actually is native to Japan. It was first introduced back in the late 19th century, but in the 60s, in the 50s and in the 60s, it was also promoted as a shrub with high wildlife potential. I mean, it's a shrubby, it's a thick shrub. It would provide cover for the birds, and of course, it would provide all these berries for the birds in the fall. It would be a wonderful thing. It became too much of a good thing. And in fact, the shrub, after being actively propagated, disseminated, even provided to farmers and so on, it actually started also spreading on its own. And it became actually an invasive. And in eastern United States and Canada, it's kind of gone, it's outdone its welcome, and it's spreading widely. In the West, we have a closely related species. It's called the Titarian honeysuckle. Which is native to southern Russia. That's also been introduced and fairly widely disseminated because of its ornamental value, flowers, lots of flowers and fruits again, and so on. And that's the species we have here in Alberta. And I'll come back to that later. There were people experimented with feeding, for example, waxwings with berries, and of course the pigment would show up in their tail feathers. But in the early 200s and so on, people were approaching me and with more examples of these birds with odd colors. I mean, we're seeing a northern oriole. This is an immature. This bird should actually look olive or green or whatnot, but it's got this intense red coloration to it. A white-throated sparrow, which normally would have this little yellow lore just above its eye or above and in front of its eye, was turning up with orange colors and so on. Both these birds were being seen at the Tommy Thompson Park in Toronto, and kind of not far from the big city and so on, and surely raised eyebrows and so on. Also, birds at the McGill Bird Observatory, like this American redstart. That's a young. That's a female actually, and you might think, oh yeah, it's got nice orange flanks and so on, but in fact it's the coloration on the back. It's got a bit of a brownish tinge to it. That should be green or olive and not the color. And we wrote an article about this in birding, actually, how berries are changing the colors of birds as an emerging process, and try to made people aware of what was going on, because people were like rather puzzled by this. Now, while we were writing this, actually, this is on 1 year. In 1996, several Orioles at the McGill Bird Observatory were turning up with these very odd colors. And they were kind enough to sample some feathers for me to look at. And so I was able to identify that indeed roloxanthine, the pigment was involved here. And that it actually, we could correlate the intensity of the redness with the amount of that pigment. So the more the bird ingested the pigment, the redder the bird would be, and so on. Okay, I want to give, I'm trying to get context and people to understand what's really happening here. And I want to explain a little bit about molts. Birds replace their feathers. They will usually do it twice a year. They will do it in the fall and then again in the spring. This shows, so a bird will usually, in its first year, it will acquire feathers in its nest. But after it leaves the nest, it will usually replace most of its body feathers. And so you see here the birds with different colors. The different colors just represent different sequences of feathers. So they replace one set of feathers with another one, and that explains the different colors. Usually the wing feathers on the first year will not be replaced. Now, and that's true in the spring. But then come the next fall, they will replace all their feathers, including their wing feathers and so on. And then usually will replace again in the spring. So you get an idea of when birds might be growing these red feathers or lose their feathers when they're being replaced and so on. Okay, so here's what we're looking for. And this is, and so I started looking at, I contacted banding station. I also started looking for images online of birds, of yellow birds that were turning up orange or red and so on by Googling, you put a species and orange and so on and compiling this. But I was looking for very specific things. First of all, I'm looking for an increase in redness. Okay, if there's a change in blue, in browns, well, maybe in browns, I'm looking for the feathers to become redder and so on, because that's what the pigment does. The pigment is a dark red pigment, and so I want to see a redness. Now, it should also only happen in feathers that normally contain carotenoids. This is not a pigment that just shows up anywhere. It will show up where the birds normally would be depositing yellow pigments. And so, in fact, it can't tell the difference. And so instead of putting the yellow pigments, it takes the red pigment that it's got in its diet. So we're looking at feathers that are yellow, red, or orange, or even green, because green is usually black combined with yellow. These feathers also would have to be grown in the fall. So in the late summer and fall when the berries are available. If these feathers were grown, let's say in the spring, it wouldn't make sense because the berries by then should no longer be available and have an effect on coloration. One last element is about it. We might tend to see it producing an uneven or a mottled look. And here's how I'm going to explain this. This is a picture of an American goldfinch in molt. It's replacing its feathers. It's molting from its winter drab coloration into a nice, colorful spring coloration, the yellow that's coming through. But you see how the yellow is distributed? It's not evenly. It starts from the head and it moves to the back. It's kind of patchy and so on. So if this bird had been consuming the honeysuckle berries when it was molting or growing those yellow feathers, this is where the orange colors would show up, and the rest that still hasn't been replaced would look perfectly fine yellow, and so it would create a mottled look and so on. I thought I'd bring in this example. This is a bird that was actually collected. It's a house finch, by the way, that was collected in Guadalajara in West Central Mexico, and I was approached to try to identify or help to sort out what was happening with this bird and so on. We suspect it's carotenoid pigmentation. Unfortunately, I didn't have feathers to confirm it, but the brightness of the color and so on makes us suspect it is a carotenoid pigmentation. If you're familiar with house finches, they don't usually have red coloration all over their body, and certainly not on their backs and so on. Here's what a house finch looks from Guadalajara. A normal house finch actually looks like. It's a little bit different. It's a little bit different from what we're used to, and certainly seems to have a bit of a massive bill. But this bird does not have, in this case, you can't see the orange coloration on the cheek patch, on the wings, on the back. That's so. And so this is not a good example. So we concluded and we published this, and that is not what you would expect from diet-related reddening and so on. This is a mutation. This is some kind of genetic, some genes were turned off and so on. And so it's just an aberration and so on. And therefore we could rule that out. And in the same way, like I said, I started and with help from about Mulvihill, was that then at the National Aviary in Pittsburgh, but formerly at the Powder Mill Research Station, we started compiling again by Googling and so on. And this is a bit daunting, so let me explain. So we have a list of species, and these are species that we were able to find examples of birds that had yellow feathers that had turned somehow orange or red and so on. So examples of a diet, what we would assume were diet-related reddening. We also compiled numbers of, how many instances of these. We looked into what plumages. Was it a spring, a fall plumage? Was it a younger bird, an older bird, male, female, and so on? We looked at, also identified the feathers that were affected. And finally, the areas that these birds were found and so on. Cedar Waxwing, again, the most example, it makes sense. Cedar Waxwing is a frugivore. It mainly consumes berries. It almost exclusively, actually, I shouldn't say that because they eat quite a bit of insects, but they feed extensively on berries. And so it's no surprise that, especially in the East where the Morrows honeysuckle are widely distributed, that they would show up. But there were a lot of other species, and that was a surprise. There were even species like the common yellow throat, the blue wing warbler, and so on, that actually had never been described as consuming fruits as part of their diet. So this was a bit of a surprise, but sure, you can't miss the red feathers and so on. But there's one example that's really one species where it's really help answer an enigma, a long-standing enigma. And I'll help you. And it's the northern flicker. You might be familiar with it. We often see them even in the city in low numbers, but in the forest. And there are two very distinctive subspecies. There's an eastern form, the yellow-shafted flicker, and the name refers to the shafts of the wings and the tail that have a yellow color to it. But on the west coast, or in western Alberta to the coast, the bird is replaced by the red-shafted flicker. And again, the color of the shaft here gives it its name. It's a reddish color, and so on. Now the two forms meet. Actually, they meet in Alberta, and in Alberta is the area where they meet, and that's an area of active research interest for us. We've been collecting blood samples and feathers from birds in Western Alberta, and their young as well, and trying to determine what genes. We're trying to get at the genes that explain the difference in color and how that might have come about. But this is not what this is about. Lester Short, when he described this, where the two species meet, they hybridize and they produce birds of intermediate color and so on. But he also pointed out that birds in eastern North America occasionally would also show red coloration in their primary feathers, in their shafts, which is really surprising. Because if indeed some genes from the red shafted were still in eastern North America, over time they should just get swamped by all the yellow shafted genes that are coming in. And so that was always a bit puzzling, certainly for Lester Short and other people, including myself after that. And that an example of one of those birds, this bird is from the McGill Bird Observatory, and you see the shafts in here don't have the natural yellow color. But another puzzling observation is that birds that were caught on consecutive years were showing different feathers that were red. So in 1976, we have these a set of primaries, but then the year after the bird was caught again, but then they were different red feathers. It's like, how do you even explain this genetically? How we're turning on genes, turning off genes, and so on. But then realizing that this could very well be a diet-related reddening made a lot of sense. I was contacted by individual. This is a fellow from Western Massachusetts, and he approached me in trying to figure out what was going on, and I was more than happy because I would finally get my hands on some of these feathers. So this is you can see clearly. Some of the primaries are yellow, but then they turn red and so on. And I was able to sample the feathers and get pigments out of them and so on. Here's another puzzling situation, is that in fact, and which makes complete sense once you think of it as a dietary issue, in that even the reddest feathers of these eastern birds were actually redder than the red-shafted flicker on the West Coast. How could a bird so far away from where it should show feathers that were even redder than the ones that normally would show some red in their feathers? Of course, it makes sense if it's a dietary thing. So I've identified here a couple of primaries. So this is the third primary. We count the primaries from the inside out. This bird is still molting, it's still growing some of its feathers and so on. But I want to show you what pigments we were coming out. And this is a way to display that. After we extract the pigments from the feathers, I can apply the extract on this plate. This plate is silica, and I can have solvents draw the pigments and separate them as they go. And this is what a red shafter would have. And you see 3 orangish pigments, carotenoids in this case. And this is what you see in the yellow feather of that bird that I just showed you. And it shows primarily two bands of yellow pigments. Now here's what the rhododxanthine looks like. This is from the berry of the Tatarian honeysuckle, which we have here in Alberta. And this is what would that 6th primary look like. I mean, there's no mistaking. So that 6th primary contains the rhododxanthine, very clearly shows the pattern that you would see in a honeysuckle. And it all of a sudden explains so much of it. Explains why in the East, they're showing in the East, why it might vary from one year to the next. The berries might be available at different times in different years and so on. Now, it's interesting because going back to this bird now, you can see, usually birds generally will molt. They replace their primaries from the inside out. They replace their feathers inside out. So this bird has already grown this one, it's fully grown, and now it's growing this feather, and all of a sudden here it must have consumed the berries, and then you see it's in the system, but slowly it's being deposited, it's being cleared from the system, and the feathers are slowly returning to the normal coloration. It just makes so much sense now to think of it as a diet-related phenomenon. Now, as I already mentioned about the Morrow's honeysuckle, it's widely distributed in Eastern North America and even somewhat out west, but it's native to Japan. And I'm lucky. I was lucky to be part of an exchange with the museum in Hokkaido. The Royal Alberta Museum has a memorandum of understanding with the Hokkaido Museum. We're sister provinces, Hokkaido and Alberta, and there's also a program of exchange between our two institutions. And I was able to go there. And of course, I wanted to check the birds there and see whether I could find examples of birds with reddened feathers where the berry is actually native. I mean, it would make some sense. And so while at the Hokkaido Museum, I visited the museum in in the Botanic Garden of Hokkaido University that has an outstanding collection of bird specimens. And we went through hundreds, literally all the birds that I thought had yellow feathers that I thought could have red feathers. And we did find some. We did find some, but only in one species. This is where the gardens where the specimens are being kept. Actually, this is not the building where we were. They actually have now built this brand new facility, a state-of-the-art facility to house the material. So what are we looking at now? We're looking at a close-up. We're looking at close-ups of gray-headed woodpecker. It's a type of woodpecker that you find in the northern island of Hokkaido. And you can see some of the feathers with red in coloration. These are the same birds. This is just a blown up of this section here. And you can see, well, maybe not so well on the screen, but there's a red, one or two red feather here. And it's overlaid by normally colored yellow feathers and so on. There was this individual had red feathers on both its shoulder. This is the same section, but blown up. Red feathers on its shoulder and also on its rump. This is the feathers on the rump. Now, my colleagues in Japan were very skeptical. They were very skeptical because they know that Morrow's honeysuckle is actually quite rare. It's not that it's rare. It's just that it's not widely distributed. It's found in coastal areas, usually all by itself, on sand dunes or meadows and whatnot. And it has a fairly limited distribution. And so they were really like, and not necessarily a habitat where a woodpecker would be to start with. But it just for me, it was just walking in the streets of Sapporo where we were and seeing there were yew trees all over town, and they make beautiful conifers, and so they're quite widely distributed in the city, for instance, as ornamental, and also naturally. This is the map for the Japanese yew of natural distribution. These are wild trees in the wilderness, I guess, but they also found in the city. As it turns out, many of the gray-headed woodpeckers that had the red feathers had been captured or found in the city. And so we kind of went to, oh, yeah, okay, you would make a lot more sense. It was a little hard to make that point in the scientific paper and using the literature. But online, you do find references to the gray-headed woodpecker actually feeding on the berries of the Japanese yew. This is from a website here where the people, and it's been translated. It says the fruit of the Japanese yew is a favorite of the gray-headed woodpeckers. Every day, a pair of gray-headed woodpeckers come to eat the fruit. And they said they may be fattening up in preparation for the winter. This is a gray-headed woodpecker. It's in a yew tree. In this case, it's a big tree. In the city, they might be much smaller and so on. But it's eating berries of the yew, and it's doing it in the fall when it's getting ready for winter, just when the berries would be available. Let's bring it back to Alberta now. I mentioned about Morrow's honeysuckle and how they're widely distributed and abundant in the east. But in the west, we have the Tatarian honeysuckle, widely distributed. Here it doesn't show B.C., but I know B.C. has them as well. And so it's been a bit of a puzzle. We have a couple of specimens of Cedar Waxwing with orange tail bands, but not many specimens at any rate. And so it's been a bit of a puzzle why we don't see as many. I've thought of, well, maybe we got lots of native berries like the chokecherry or Maydays or whatnot. But just a few years ago, I was approached by some individuals with Western birds that were showing red feathers. Just a couple of years ago, it was these two birds are migrants that were observed in San Diego. So the birds are on the move right now. These two birds were on the move. And this bird was actually photographed in Montana. And these birds would normally be at this time, and they would be yellow. And of course, you can see the bright blotches of red, orange coloration on their feathers and so on. This supports the notion that actually the immature Western tanagers replace their feathers on their breeding grounds, whereas the adults actually move to Mexico to molt. And of course, there are no honeysuckle berries there. And of course, and as a result, we didn't find any adults. Again, we looked online or in collections as well. We looked for specimens, and we were not able to find adult Western tanagers that had the red coloration. And that supports the idea that they, unlike the immature, which molt and replace their feathers on the breeding grounds where honeysuckle berries could be available, the adults are in areas where there are no honeysuckle berries and so on. So it nicely supports that idea. I was even more surprised when this bird, when documentation, I chair a rare bird committee, and the red-breasted sapsucker is not common at all in the province. And I was provided with documentation on this bird that was photographed by Cornell in Pincher Creek. And of course, your eyes are drawn to the red on the head and the chest and so on. But that's not where the story, that's not where the interest lies. It's on the back. Normally, the back of that bird should have yellow, very light colored yellow feathers. But I hope you can see the redness. There's redness in this bird, and which was a surprise. And it would suggest that also this bird consumed berries containing rhodoxanthine. And we're actually collaborating with Peter Pyle, who was able to go to the California Academy of Natural Science, and he also was able to document other red-breasted sapsuckers that had red coloration on their backs, where you would expect either yellow or just faded out white and so on. So now some of these specimens go back quite a few years, and probably before Tatarian honeysuckle were widely distributed. And so in this case, we suspect they might have been eating another the berries of another species of yew, the Pacific yew. There's a Pacific, British Columbia and the western states in there. The wet forest, humid forests of the west have a yew of their own, and it's the Pacific, and that may very well be what's happening here. Okay, conclusion. What have we learned, and how is this useful, and how can we benefit from knowing this? For one, it's help us identify species that do feed on berries. I mean, like I mentioned, common yellowthroat was not thought to actually consume berries, but birds were showing up with orange feathers. So it gets an insight into the birds' diets. It also gives us ideas of a timing of feather replacement. So we can tell, these feathers that are red were molted in the fall. And then we can also look whether are they still there in the spring. So if they're still in the springs, it means they haven't been replaced. And so we're learning about what feathers are being replaced when, and then replaced again or not in the spring and so on. But I know you guys are all dying. You're all dying to ask the real question. And this is the real question, is will she accept him or care of the difference? There's mounting evidence that the appearance of the birds is often used by mates, by individual birds to gauge, to measure the quality of a potential mate. Why would these bright colors develop? If there was not some kind of clues as to the quality of the individual. And in fact, we're now getting to some of the mechanism where in fact the coloration might be tied to some basic physiological process, so that only the best, the strongest male are able to show the brightest and more colorful colors. Now this has the potential to really mess up this system. If you have a secure system to judge, to assess a potential mate, but now you can have cheaters, that fed on berries and so on. It makes the system really not that useful anymore. Now we don't know. We really don't know, and that's still I'm trying to figure out whether we should be worried or not about this, and because we don't know. But the appearance of many birds are changing, and it has the potential to mess up into these cues and so on. Maybe the females will judge other characteristics in addition to coloration. They might go with behavior or ability, size or whatnot. And that's the end. And I thought I wanted to share this picture that was just sent to me just a couple of days ago. These are northern orioles. They're male. This is what the northern oriole actually they were called northern oriole. Now they've gone back to being the Baltimore oriole. This is what a Baltimore oriole should normally look. It's a bird of orange color. But look at this extreme redness shown by this other bird. That bird even has one tail feather of a different color than the other one. So presumably they weren't molted or replaced at the very same time. But that shows how extreme it could get, and really how it could really mess up the system of judging a male quality based on its appearance. And I'll leave it at that. I'll open it for questions if you have any.
Thank you, Jocelyn. That was a fantastic presentation. And thank you for sharing those beautiful pictures. Oh my goodness, the level of detail was just amazing. So we're transitioning into the second part of our program, and I can already see many great comments and questions popping up. So I will start by sharing a comment from one of our visitors. And this visitor is saying, we have red-shafted flickers in the Puget Sound in Washington State and over the mountains, but I've seen yellow around Christmas in Courtenay on Vancouver Island.
That's a good point. Those are migrants. So actually, if you go to western, so you think of British Columbia, the southern part and to the west, yeah, they're mostly red-shafted flickers. But if you go just further north and into northern British Columbia, Yukon, and even Alaska, those birds are yellow-shafted. So they're migrants. The red-shafted don't migrate as much, but the red-shafted are, they live along the coast where it's milder and so on. They don't move so much, but the yellow-shafted, they certainly in the north, they really get out of there. And they'll end up in Washington State. And those are usually winter birds. They're there, they're migrants. They're there just for the winter. And come spring, they'll head back north for breeding.
Just relaying another comment, which says, awesome. Great presentation. And I guess we can get started with the questions. So the first one is that, do the Lonicera native to Alberta also has the chemical that would cause the erythrism, not just the introduced honeysuckle?
Thank you for bringing it up. I failed to mention that, but yes, the Tatarian honeysuckle is very closely related to the Morrow's honeysuckle, and it contains the very same pigment, the rhodopsantine and so on. So it has the potential to change the color of the birds. Other than the yew trees, which aren't very common, again, they may be not common at all in Alberta. So it would be mainly the honeysuckles, the Morrows and Titarian, that could potentially cause the change in color.
All right, thank you very much. So, this one is a very interesting question. Are there other types of animals that change the color of feathers based on their diet?
Generally not. Generally, birds are they're very careful into what they put in their feathers. Breeders have known that feathers with carotenoids can be altered They would, canary breeders used to feed paprika powder to get their canaries to show orange color. And that was done for a while. That was the only way. And then until they were able to they cross the canary with a bird that has red, that can naturally produce red pigments. And so now they introduced the gene of that into the canary, and now the canary don't need the pigment in their diet. But generally birds know, I mean, yes, in a sense, if the color reflects the quality of the bird, if a bird is malnourished or struggling somehow, it would affect generally the coloration, but not in the way that this berry is doing it.
And on the note of canaries, I have a comment here says, I know that domesticated red factor canaries do not keep their red color unless they get enough red pigment in their diet. It might be interesting to see if this is a common quality of yellow pigmented feathers specifically.
Well, you bring up an interesting point. And the fact is that, as I mentioned, birds cannot make carotenoids, so they have to get in their diet. But the canaries with the red factor, in order to produce the red pigment, they got to get the yellow pigment to be able to do the conversion. So yes, they need to be provided with proper nutrition and the right pigments. And about the change, I think it's mostly related to the diet. You need to provide them the yellow pigment, and unless there's instability in the expression of the gene. And that would be new knowledge to me. I didn't know that, if that's the case.
On to the next questions. How long does it take for the colors to show up in the feathers? Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation, Monsieur Hudon.
That's within hours. I'd say within hours of consumption of the berries, the pigment can show up. The only experiments that really have been done of feeding the birds were in Cedar Waxwings, where the birds were actually, the feather was plucked and they let it grow, and they could time the provisioning, the berries with the pigment and so on. And it's within hours and within the day for sure of consumption. The flicker, not so much with respect to the rhodopsantine, but there's also been experiments on the flicker. Test was the fellow at the University of California, Berkeley, years ago. And he also did experiments where he denied carotenoids to the flicker and then gave them, and sure enough, it's within hours they would show it in the feathers as the feather is growing.
I have another good question here. So why do you think the type of food they eat is affecting the color of the plumage? They cannot metabolize that type of food, or maybe it's a defense mechanism to blend with the entire environment?
You know, to be perfectly honest, it's an unintended. It's just this thing that, I mean, I'm sure it's just a consequence of this availability of this pigment, which the birds have really no ability to keep away from. They have no ability. Once they've ingested it, it's in their system. It's going to go in the feather. It's going to go alongside carotenoids in the feathers. It's just an unintended consequences, really. It's not something that the birds even knows about it. It's probably surprised. It's, oh, where did this red color in my wings came from? And it's strictly limited. It's the honeysuckle right now, except for berries and some of the places where those are available as well. And I hope that answers your question.
We will see if we receive more comments about this. The next one, I guess I can take, because will this talk be posted online later? My computer has to update and I missed the first 10 minutes. Of course, check our website and in a few days we will post this video. So this will be freely accessible anytime. Thank you for this question. And more questions for you, of course. So very interesting. This may be off topic from berry-induced pigmentations, but what about pigmentation in general, like the blue beak of the ruddy duck? How does this come about?
Yeah, it's one thing with birds. I'm interested in coloration, pigmentation, and there's so much. I mean, birds are like us. They're very visual, and have developed, the coloration to extreme extents, not just in the size of it, but in the diversity, in the range of colors, and so on. And they have evolved a number of mechanisms. The feather is a wonderful medium for the birds to be able to manipulate. They can do all kinds of things. They can create structures and whatnot. With respect to the blue bill of the ruddy duck, it's actually a structural coloration. There are no blue pigments. They would be too difficult energy. It would be too much energy to produce a blue pigment. It's a lot cheaper to just produce a structural color that will produce a blue coloration. And what happens is that the blue color is actually, the top of the bill has very small cavities, and they diffract the light from the light. And so the blue is bounces around and goes back out to you, whereas all the other colors go through and are absorbed by the black pigment at the bottom. When that color usually disappears once the animal dies. It's a fleshy, but it's got these bubbles and whatnot, but it's fleshy. And when the bird dies, it kind of collapses, and all of a sudden you see it's mostly a grayish color. And that's because of the underlying black coloration that underlies it. And so, but birds have evolved different. The carotenoids, there's melanins, they're porphyrins, they're all cytocofulvins. The parrots have their own pigment types. And then structurally, they can do iridescence, they can do blues, and they combine blues with yellows, it becomes greens and so on. It's quite remarkable, actually.
More questions. So the next one is, why are some birds all black? What advantage is there to being all black in a hot climate? Wouldn't they overheat?
Good question. And yes, the potential for a black bird to overheat is very much so. Now, the beauty with feathers is that though they may be black, if you can pull the feathers away from the body, the heat may not transfer necessarily to your body. But you bring up a good point. We have a lot of black birds in North America, I mean, in Canada. And actually, it's the opposite. Having a black plumage is very beneficial in the winter when things get really cold. It absorbed the radiation and so on. There was a paper recently that showed that a lot of birds that fly that are migrants actually show lighter color than birds that tend to live up north and migrate less. And the thought there is that yes, if they were flying at high altitude, in the sun, blazing sun, they could get quite hot, given that flying to a bird for long periods of time is it produces a lot of heat in itself. And so it's thought that the birds that it's beneficial to have white feathers in this case, so they don't overheat, and they have a way to not overheat.
And I have another interesting question. So do insects have pigments that can change feather colors?
Yeah, so like speaking of carotenoids, they have to get it, the birds have to get it from their diet. You think of the tanager, it mostly feeds on insects, and insects, will, and they themselves will have gotten the carotenoids from plant material or other insects or whatnot. So yes, the insects, the flickers, they get their colors from the ants. And yes, I've looked at ants and tried to find the pigment in the ants. And sure enough, they have a little bit of yellow pigment in them. And that's what the flicker presumably uses to create its bright colors.
And this one is a very good question. I never thought about that myself, but probably you have an answer for that, most certainly. So do you think that if tropical colorful birds like parrots changed their diet, they would stay the same color, or would that change?
Okay, there's a couple of points, and one is a surprise. But first of all, parrots. So let's focus on parrots. The parrots have their own pigment. They've evolved their own different. They're called cytocofulvins. They ingest carotenoids, but they don't deposit. So their bright colors are not carotenoid based. But what the other thing I want to mention is the Native American from South America had developed a method using the fluid. Okay, this is complicated. The fluid from poison arrow frogs. So they would dabble the poison arrow frog fluid onto areas of the parrot where the feathers were plucked. They would rub it in, mix in with other things, and the feathers, instead of growing yellow, what they would normally do, they were turning red. So this is still a bit controversial, but Native American and South America had developed a way. They would use the bright color feathers of parrots for different accessories and so on, and they would keep parrots as pets, and they would do this procedure, and birds that would produce red feathers for their uses and so on. But generally, tropical birds, they do a lot of the same thing as our birds do.
And I have a comment rather than a question from the chat. So I have a green-cheeked conure, and you can really see how the green color in her feather are more structural than pigmented. Her feathers are iridescent green in sunlight, but when they are soaked from a bath, she doesn't really look green at all.
Exactly. So this is a good way to tell a structural color from a pigment color. A pigment color, if you look through the feather against the light, it would still have the same color. But if you take like a feather of a blue jay and you look through it, it would look black. And you're absolutely right. That you got it right.
And one more question. Congratulations, excellent talk. How long do the pigments last without degradation in the feather after you collect the feather from the bird in the field?
The feather is essentially inert and dead, and we can keep those colors. We put the feathers in envelopes, and we can keep them indefinitely. In fact, the yellow color, I showed you the red-breasted sapsuckers from the collection, and normally the feathers on the back should be yellow, but that yellow fades very quickly, but not the red. The red is very, very stable that way, and so birds that molt and get these red feathers, they can keep them the whole year until the feathers are replaced again.
All right, thank you very much, Jocelyn. Let's see if we have more questions coming up. Let's give it a minute. And again, feel free to ask your questions. This is for you. So we want to hear your input, your experiences. Let us know if you have more questions. Okay, we have a couple of comments saying thank you and saying such fun.
Well, you're welcome.
Great presentation, learned a lot. Yeah, we definitely learned very much about the diet of birds and the impact it can have on the feathers. That was just phenomenal. And more people are saying the presentation was great. Great indeed. Excellent job, Jocelyn. And other people are saying that they love birds and enjoyed this talk very much. All right, I guess we are about to wrap up this talk. I hope you really enjoyed, but I'm sure that you had, based on your comments. And before we say goodbye, I just have a couple of things that I like to share. So we have a quick program survey available at the end of this talk. We want to hear from you, and we would like to know what kind of programs and experiences you would like to see in the future, both virtually and in person. So the survey will automatically open in your browser at the end of the talk, and the data will be collected anonymously, of course. So this is a super quick survey. It's basically 5 minutes of your time. And if you do not want to participate, well, that's okay. And you can just close your browser. I also wanted to remind you that we have another talk coming up on May 20 in the next talk, which is elk ivory pendants in Alberta. We're going to learn about some interesting archaeological discoveries in our province. So make sure to reserve your spot. And thank you again for attending Up Close, Stories, Objects, and Ideas from Beyond the Galleries. I hope to see you at our next talk. Again, thank you, Jocelyn, and take care, everyone.